Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Before we get started with our conversation on domestic violence and non-state torture, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Patricia Cumby with Global Rights for Women, and we will start with a land acknowledgement. Global Rights for Women gratefully acknowledges the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and acknowledges we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people around the world. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Since people are joining us from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land you're acknowledging, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I am Vayona Gupta and will be today's moderator. I am the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor for Global Rights for Women. Valiant Voices is a conversation series Global Rights for Women created that features human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are stories of leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We are pleased to share that Valiant Voices was the 2023 recipient of the National Purple Ribbon Award for Outstanding Domestic Violence Podcast. This recognition for excellence would not be possible without our generous donors who support these conversations and the guests who bring their authentic selves, sharing their experiences, expertise, and passionate commitment to ending gender-based violence around the world. We are also grateful Valiant Voices has been funded in part by the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation. We welcome your comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. After the conversation, we'll send out a link with the recording. If you need a certificate of attendance, please contact us at Global Rights for Women at grwomen.org. Today, we'll be talking about gender-based violence. We recognize that there are survivors here. Parts of this conversation might be triggering, so we are including resources for people in the US and internationally in the chat who need safety and assistance. Please take good, gentle care of yourself during and after this conversation. I am pleased to introduce our panelists to you today. Jean Sarso and Linda McDonald are human rights defenders and feminist activists who began developing their grassroots science expertise in 1993, supporting women who identified surviving non-state torture and sexualized exploitation as women and or as adults. They engage in participatory research present nationally and internationally and have many published articles and book chapters. Their book, Women Unsilenced, A Refusal to Let Torturer Traffickers Win, was released in 2021. They are now working on their second book titled Healed. They have been active in the United Nations work since 2004 in New York, Geneva, and Vienna. Plus, they are politically engaged in Canada, testifying to create knowledge of family and non-family based non-state torture victimizations, challenging patriarchal political and legal oppression that persists in denying women's right to truth-telling and name the victimization they survived as a crime of torture perpetrated by non-state actors. Elizabeth Gordon is an artist, feminist art activist, musician, and writer. She grew up experiencing violent torture in her home. Making art and playing music was how she created space from terror. When my memories began pouring out in 2009, I drew stick drawings to help in my recovery and healing process, she says. She contributes her art and story to books, articles, and educational work on non-state torture. In art activism, she focuses on raising awareness of torture and trafficking of children in informal criminal networks. She has exhibited her art at Philia UK conferences since 2014 and spoken with Jean and Linda at Philia, at the UN in New York and Vienna, and on various podcasts and blogs. She advocates that healing from non-state torture is possible with feminist, human rights-based, non-state torture-informed care. Sylvia Marino holds a master's degree in criminology for investigation and security from the University of Bologna, with a particular interest in the societal impact of gender-based violence. She is a part of the working group on gender-based violence is torture inflicted by non-state actors. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. For this session, we are joined by this group that advocates for a groundbreaking approach to the concept of torture under international law. They argue that certain forms of violence perpetrated by private individuals or groups, rather than by state actors, should be formally recognized as non-state torture in the United Nations Convention Against Torture. This expansion would push the boundaries of current international legal definitions and obligations, where torture is often associated with wars and enemy combatants. All of our panelists aim to address severe abuses inflicted outside of state-sanctioned contexts of torture. Today, we'll learn what these terms mean and delve into their views on why this shift is essential, how they define and distinguish these acts of violence, and what the broader implications can be for survivor protections worldwide. So we'll begin with our questions. And Linda, I have my first question for you. So you spent your career both helping survivors and raising awareness that certain forms of gender-based violence is non-state torture. Why do you think it's important for our systems and societies to acknowledge non-state torture? And while you explain this to us, can you also talk a little bit about what non-state torture really means for our audiences?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Why it's important is because it's a distinct crime, non-state torture is. And if you don't name the crime, then we don't have laws to criminalize the crime, we don't have the right healing, we don't have education, we don't have social transformation. And what I want to do is to give you the definition of what has evolved over time. When Jean and I first started in 1993, put my timer on, we were mainly thinking about families, because the first woman that came to us, she was tortured by her family. But that definition has evolved, and it's evolved to occur in the domestic or in the private sphere, in relationships perpetrated within families, in human trafficking, in prostitution, in pornographic exploitation by violent groups and gangs, dismissed as social, cultural, traditional, or religious acts, and can be committed during migration, displacement, and in humanitarian or civil unrest. And some of the acts of non-state torture, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, would be electric shocking, burning, whipping, water tortures in tubs, toilets, suffocation, strangulation, choking, polydrugging, and all different forms of chemical torture, deprivations of sleep, food, cold and hot exposure, psychological tortures, grave dehumanization, forced nakedness, witnessing others being tortured, and the abject powerlessness of captivity, and also ritualism torture tactics. So that's some of the different types of torture that we're talking about that happen within these groups that I just described. And the difference between abuse and torture, for people to gain some clarity, abuse is about a perpetrator trying to gain power and control over the victim, over his victim, mostly men, not always, but mostly. Or in torture, it's the goal of total destruction of the woman or girl's sense of self. Now that's not achieved often, but that's the goal. And this goal causes extreme dissociation responses. And Jean and my framework is that dissociation, although socially now is really deemed a mental illness, we reject that bias and say that women and girls are not mentally ill if they dissociate. That is indeed a normal response to torture, and that means that they should not be seen as mentally ill, that they're survivors of non-state torture, and it's really a discrimination to label them as mentally ill. So that's our basic framework, and it might give some platform for others to discuss it more in the conversation, and I'll leave it there, Vayuna.
Linda, if I can just ask you a quick follow-up question to that. Can you also explain for our audiences how and what the difference could be between state torture and non-state torture, and how it's important for us to look at non-state torture specifically when it comes to certain acts of violence in this conversation?
Okay. Well, basically, the only difference between state and non-state torture is the perpetrators. In state torture, they're military, they're police, they're in embassies. Mainly, torture is designated as what happens to men. It started out in Men in War. So the perpetrators would be all of those, mostly men that work in prisons too as well. Any site structure that's employed and organized by the state. Now, non-state torture is the exact same acts that I described here, but they're perpetrated by non-state actors or people who are in the everyday sense, a father, a mother, a human trafficker, a buyer, a pimp, someone that's trafficking migrant women. They would be the non-state torturers, and they would do the same acts of torture, but one is employed by the state and one is a non-state actor. So that's basically the difference between the two crimes.
Thank you, Linda, for that clarification. And Jean, moving on to you. Like Linda explained, most people think of torture in the context of what happens in a war and what happens to enemy combatants. Can you talk about your work that connects certain forms of gender-based violence directed towards women and girls to torture and how it's related to torture? And while you do that, can you also tell us what led you to come to this conclusion in the international legal sphere overall, through your study, your research, and your experiences working with survivors of non-state torture?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And it's actually one that we've been thinking about really for 31 years. And maybe there's people listening to us that are as naive as we were when we started, because in 1993, when Linda and I started, what our premise is that we both grew up in family violence, and we both had sexualized victimization in our lives. And we also knew that healing was possible and getting on and living your life was fine. So when the first woman came and very quickly started describing and even used the word torture, even though she didn't have a concept, it's just that for her, intuitively, that's how she felt, that she was tortured. And then she started describing what Linda has just explained around the water torture and the electric shocking and all the forms of physical, and there's sexualized and reproductive tortures that went on. So very quickly, we accepted that what she was saying was torture. So our first shock was that we thought, well, Canada must have a law that would cover torture by her perpetrators, which were originally her family and the whole informal network that her family was connected to, because you can't have human trafficking without a network of buyers. They go together. And we were shocked to find out, indeed, Canada did not and still does not have a law that covers non-state actors who perpetrate torture. So that was a shock. So then we thought, well, the UN must do something about that. So we found ways to go to the UN and found out at the UN the same thing was still happening. There was massive discrimination when it came to the issue of torture and who the perpetrators are. So that was kind of shock number 3, I guess. So over the time, I've been thinking a lot about it and writing this, our second book. I've been making a list because sometimes we kind of forget the clues that we have. So I'm kind of making a list, and I wrote it here, so I'm going to kind of refer to it because I might not remember everything. It's about getting the facts right. And I have about 10 facts there that are about massive contradictions in the literature and around patriarchal and misogynistic discrimination. And the first one, like I said, was we assumed that the country in the UN would know under Article 5 of the Universal Declaration that says no one should be subjected to torture, that everyone would understand that. Of course, that's not what happened. Non-state actors are not identified as torturers. So that was more discrimination for the women. We'd have to say to them, you have a human right to do this, but the world has not yet accepted that. So their second point was the idea that so often in the literature you hear eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. But that is limited because 17 years ago, Linda and I worked hard with the support of other NGOs in New York at the CSW to have torture in the outcome document when relating to the violence against the girl child. And that was in 2007. So every year after that, we've tried and got it in, but it's always kicked out again. So that discrimination is ongoing. That contradiction, you have a statement that says all forms, and yet you have a contradiction where that's not accepted. The third one is around, we're hearing a lot about the application of the rule of law. And at a grassroots level, the rule of law is supposed to be fair to everyone. So if we are saying that no one should be subjected to torture, and yet if the perpetrators are non-state actors, then that torture victimization is again invisibilized. So it's more contradiction. Our number 4 was the idea that due diligence is supposed to uphold the dignity of every human being. So if women are trying to explain that they were tortured and yet they're not being heard and not being listened to and not respected, here again, their voice is silenced, their victimization is invisibilized. So there's more contradiction in the literature and how we're behaving as a global community around human rights. Number 5 is how the UN classifies a crime, and they have 4 elements. The first one is the behaviors of the perpetrator. So now Linda explained that we see the same behaviors when it comes to so-called classic torture on both sides. So we created we call it the patriarchal divide, that if you're on the side of the non-state tortures, you're dismissed. So that's more contradiction and more discrimination. So the categories or the elements were the actions of the perpetrator, their intentionality, which we know, who they decide to victimize, and what the relationship is between the perpetrator and the victim. So women can tell you all that very clearly. They know that. Number 6 is a victim-centered approach. So if we want to uphold a victim-centered approach, yet we're not letting women be heard respectfully to say, yes, we hear that you have suffered torture by non-state actors. There's more discrimination, more contradiction. And the use of terminology. Women are often faced, like Linda mentioned, of being considered disordered or mentally ill instead of being suffering the responses of being a victim of non-state torture perpetrators. So that contradiction invisibilizes them some more. And Linda's already mentioned briefly around the victimization and the traumatization care. We do not support just talking about traumatization informed care, because trauma is generally a response to some kind of action that occurred that causes a person to suffer some kind of pain, whether it's psychological, whether it's environmental, whether it's personal. You can have a flood and be traumatized because you lost your child in the flood. Non-state torture is a victimization crime that has been invisibilized. So that's more contradiction and more discrimination. So number 9 is around the 16 days of activism that we have going on now around femicide. So if we don't acknowledge that the crime of non-state torture exists, we don't understand the MO of the perpetrators, we don't understand the survival responses of the women and girls. And I talk about women and girls because that's Linda and my knowledge. The other children we know are harmed, but we don't have that knowledge to talk about them. So we miss the fact that femicide can occur because women have, as little girls, their perpetrators taught them how to die by suicide if they ever told on the family. So we're talking about a conditioned form of femicide that gets missed over and over again. So that's more discrimination if we don't acknowledge the form of crime. So number 10 is really, there is a solution. We keep hearing that laws can be transformed and it's not that hard. So if we have massive contradiction in the literature and massive discrimination, it should not be that hard legally to change the law. So that's kind of a capture of our 31 years of trying to break the discrimination.
No, Linda and Jean, thank you so much for all your work and your research on non-state torture and bringing it to light for all of us here in the world who probably never think about it as non-state torture. And I have a lot of questions on your experience when you've been advocating for non-state torture in international forums with international organizations and international NGOs, but we'll come to it later. And I want to move on to you, Elizabeth, because with Linda and Jean's background on their research and work, I think you'll be able to give a very realistic experience and note to our audience here. And when we think of torture, or most of us think of torture, we usually think of it as deprivation of liberty, loss of control, and the severity of trauma that is inflicted on another person. And Elizabeth, you have spoken publicly as a survivor of non-state torture, and thank you for your enormous courage and resolve that you've shown for the information to so many people around the world. And so my question for you would be, what is it that advocates need to understand about non-state torture as it relates to your experience?
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share my voice. It's important to name non-state torture on the continuum of violence, to acknowledge that torture happens. I knew that I'd survived torture before I could begin to speak about it. So it was a real relief to me to begin to hear a question like, do you think you were tortured? And I remember feeling at last I can tell the truthful reality of what happened to me in my childhood. Before I'd found non-state torture named on Gina Linda's website, I'd felt invisible, that the torture violence I'd survived in my childhood didn't matter or didn't exist because I'd not seen it named anywhere. I felt I didn't exist as a person in my community and in the world. I felt alienated, silenced, shattered, and unhealed. Naming torture opened the space for me to begin to tell the story, to talk about the torture harms, and so begin to heal. A woman, a girl, a survivor of non-state torture has the right to speak their truth and to be believed and understood, to be listened to with respect and dignity and not pathologized is healing. Women and children who've been tortured have had their human rights violated by perpetrators. They're not crazy and don't have a disorder. I hate the word disorder. It's freeing and healing to be listened to by persons who know the truth, that there's nothing wrong with you, that you had survival responses to being tortured. And it's important to be familiar with the different acts of torture so a person can tell the worst things that have happened. For example, I was drugged at home like Giselle Pellico. I didn't know this until each time my memories came through, I had drugging responses. And once I understood what my symptoms were telling me, I could put this together with how I still had the after effects of the drugging when I was at school the next day after a night's torture. A feminist human rights framework is absolutely liberating for me. When I understood that I'm a person with human rights, not to be subjected to torture, this freed me. And this was fundamental to my being able to heal. And feminist because it's been important to me to understand what happened to me in a social, political, patriarchal structure context. So I'm not alone. Healing is possible. My story came out slowly, piece by piece, in different ways, through body talk, drawings, writing, and in healing conversations. And this is releasing, which is positive and healthy. Telling each piece freed me a little bit more. I've learned recently it's important to have hope for a woman that she can heal and to carry that hope in her healability. The power of hope for her future, for her life. I didn't know that actually before. I feel like I like being healed and feeling inner peace. I like my relationship with myself. I like truth telling. I like being healed, as this means after many years, I sleep at night now and wake up each day with hope and freedom to be creative.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing your experiences and your healing. I'm sorry that as a society, we made you feel unheard, but I'm also glad that you found the support that you needed to heal. And I'm glad that you were able to go through all of that journey. Sylvia, I have my next question for you. And like Elizabeth mentioned, the case for Giselle Pellico. When we think about the case, which is going on now in France, where Giselle's husband is on trial for drugging her and inviting dozens of men to rape her when she was unconscious, I feel like it is hard for an average person to wrap their minds around something something like this could happen, and perhaps think of it as something which is rare and which is very, very deviant given the level of cruelty that it represents. Yet, when we think of it, there were 50 sort of average men who participated in doing this. And we know that systemic operation of women is very, very complicit in these crimes. So, what do you think is the path to accountability for such non-state torture and justice for victim survivors, both at a local level and also internationally?
Thank you, Vayuna, for your question. Yes, as you mentioned, when we hear about public opinion on this case, we can often see comments such as, how could something like this happen? How could there be such people existing in this world? And the fact is that this is attributed to some extreme level of deviance. But actually, one integral part of the systemic violence, gender-based violence and violence against women is this kind of neutralization techniques, this kind of astralization of responsibility of perpetrators in such a way that it's either attributed to something wrong with the victim, and this is the phenomenon of victim blaming, of course, or to some kind of mental illness of the perpetrator. Anyway, there is this tendency to research for something that is external, outside of personal responsibility. And this can happen with gender-based violence, domestic violence, and it also happens with non-state torture. There is no limit to what can happen, but somehow it's not even contemplated. So thanks to Giselle Pellico's outstanding bravery, thanks to her outstanding moral integrity, I have to say, we can see this in the trial, where we can hear the justification that perpetrators brought to the trial chamber. And for example, they said that they thought it was consensual. They saw her husband, and so they thought it was consensual, obviously. And their opinion was even more validated. So apart from some very rare exception, the perpetrators denied their responsibility or showed completely no remorse. And this is a very vast demographic of people aging from 25 to more than 70 years old. So I think that these elements of denial of responsibility and attribution of the blame to some kind of mental illness are very difficult to challenge, but they have to be challenged if we want to achieve accountability. So first of all, talk about it. There is an increase in talk about victim blaming, but the idea of denial of responsibility doesn't get brought up enough in talks. And it has to be provided as training to everyone involved in processes and in the justice system. So from the people who hear crimes being reported to social workers, healthcare workers, and the people who are actively involved in the trial, in order to know that this kind of misconception ends up going deep inside the very fabric of society, and it ends up acting as a kind of justification. It ends up acting as a alleviating circumstance. It ends up diminishing the crime. So this brings me to the second part of my answer, which is what is in the path to accountability, calling the crime by its name, calling it torture, so that it can be recognized that it is extremely grave and cruel, and it does happen. So at a local level, training, and at an international level, just address the incongruences, misconceptions that are already there in the international law, that are already there, recognized by the Committee Against Torture, by bodies of international law. The states have the responsibility to protect their citizens from the violation of basic human rights according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 5. And the fact that international law typically punishes classic torture, as Jean defined it, does not absolutely resolve the issue of accountability, because the state becomes accountable in the very moment that it doesn't provide necessary legislation to protect its citizens. And this is the main purpose of our working group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for also telling us that this is more non-state torture is more prevalent than what we think and how often we think it does happen, and all the international mechanisms which lack acknowledging this sort of violence as torture. It's really important that we talk about, like you said, the acts of abuse as torture when they deserve that recognition, and that's how we're able to find solutions as a society to non-state torture. So thank you so much for that. And I have a question for you, Jean and Linda, and I did hint on this before as well after you spoke, Jean. With all of your advocacy for so many years, I think 32 years is what you said, is there, so when you've advocated for this, have you faced pushback? And when you face pushback, what has that been like, either at an international organization level or at an international NGO level? And B, when you face this pushback, which I'm sure you must have, how did you maneuver around it? I feel it's just really important for a lot of advocates working in the gender-based violence space overall, even if not limited to or not directly in non-state torture, to learn about maneuvering pushbacks and making that change, because it's really, really hard and it takes a lot of time to aim for and to work with states, with international organizations, with communities for improving and gender-based violence experiences or getting them out of the societal framework in the first place.
Well, I can start. Yes, we've had a huge amount of pushback, because whenever you're pushing for transformation, patriarchy doesn't like it. And I was shocked, because I thought that bystanders would, as soon as they heard about the crime, they would open their arms with caring, but that's not really what we've been received. Because the crime is discriminated and torture is such a taboo, especially around women and girls, then we experience discrimination, or people thought we were crazy and mentally ill ourselves, and they actually told us that, like 10 years after we've been pushing, they realized we weren't, but they thought we were both mentally ill as women, as nurses. So we've backlash at all levels, whether it's local, national, international, NGOs, and at the UN as well. And I think the keys for me was to process the shock, not to go into fear, push through any emotions that I had. I had fear at the beginning, because I thought, how are we going to do this if all we get is backlash? And also just to never give up, because I just feel so firmly, I have such a strong belief that this is such an important crime to be exposed for women and girls globally, that we can't give up. So I'm not blaming myself. I don't blame myself for the lack of political will that we're subjected to. I don't take blame when people say, well, you're not doing it this right or that right. We know that our strategy is firm, because we keep building momentum. So I think I'm as determined as I was when I was a little girl, that I was gonna maintain my own rights in my family where my father was violent, that I'm not letting the world do the same to silence us and all the little girls and women that need to be heard. So that's my story.
I will add to Linda's. I think we have to remember that that patriarchy has a long, long history. And for Linda and I, we start pushing for the historical, because it is different how history and men's history evolves and how women's history evolved. So one key for us over the 31 years is we had to be very, very determined to be very, very strict, if you will, about our development of grassroots science theory, how we would identify why non-state torture should be called torture was based on the research that even looking at state torture research, there was no actually, and back in 1993, we couldn't just put in, give us a list of what state torture was. We had to go through the literature and find pieces through amnesty, through special rapporteurs, and gradually come up with a definition. And we knew we had to be very firm and very diligent in what we did, because not only, as Linda said, we were getting personal backlash, but we'd get professional backlash. And if we couldn't stand the test of the backlash, we also knew there was a risk to the women who were trusting us with telling their stories. And if we weren't firm, then there'd be more discreditation of the women. So it's a relationship of trust in each other, trust with the women, and also I would say that when we had backlash, we tried to address it. There were a few times that I regret that we didn't address it for different reasons, because the backlash came in places that we weren't expecting. For example, one of the first, if you will, United Nations kind of backlash was the first time we presented at the CSW in 2004. We had several women write to the chair of the CSW to say that we didn't have permission to share the stories that we were sharing, which was not true. We had permission, written permission, from all the art that we shared and the stories that we shared. We didn't hear about this for a long time, and there were actions coming towards us at that level that we didn't understand because we didn't know the backlash for a while. So I think the issue is you have to not take it personally, because you know it's patriarchal, you know there's social conditioning, massive social conditioning globally, so that we got to the stage that we expect the backlash is going to come, and we just have learned to be very assertive and very responsible and certain about how we address it. And just be careful and know the facts, because, for example, the one thing we haven't talked about is the issue of soft law at the UN level. Women and NGOs can put in shadow reports, and they may not be listened to at the national level, because shadow reports, when we went to the UN, to the committees, different committees, either non-state torture was not addressed at all because the experts told her they were too intimidated to address it with the nations, or at the Committee Against Torture, one time we had a lot of support, and the second time we were told we didn't fit. So you have to know that the social conditioning around torture is massive, that it's really patriarchal, male dominant, and it's not going to transform in a hurry. That's what we've learned. So that's the naivety too that we came in with, because we thought in 2 or 3 years this would be resolved, and here we are 31 years later, and we're not giving up still.
I can't even imagine how tough it must have been for you to go 30 years back into those rooms and have these conversations and face the backlash that you have, not just professionally, but personally. So, and just kudos to you and all the work that you've done for all of these years where you're continuing to advocate for non-state torture. Thank you so much for that. I want to be a little mindful of the time because I want to leave time for audience questions, but I also do want us to address something important and more positive. And I want to talk about what is the future that you see and what is the hope and the healing that you would want our audiences to carry with themselves after the session ends today. And I just want to point out, we probably have only a couple of minutes we can give before we move on to audience questions, but I'd love to chat about this.
You wanted us to talk about it, you mean, Jean and I? Okay. So the future, we have a lot of hope for the future. Eventually it will come. And we want to see laws against non-state torture all around the world. There are laws in some countries now that are laws that don't differentiate between state or non-state. They're just general laws against torture. And we'd like to see a UN declaration on non-state torture to raise awareness, growing awareness and education. Somebody's asking about how you educate professionals. So that's what the declaration would do. And see that women can eventually come to court and say, I was subjected to non-state torture, and get justice in court for that, and actually have non-state torture informed care, victimization, traumatization informed care, be in centers all around the world, because women contact us all the time and we have to tell them we don't know of any such care. We'd love to be able to give them some, but it's just not possible. There's just not the social caring yet. That's, I think, I'll bring it back to caring again. So those are my ideas.
I very quickly would follow to explain the importance of a law. Because when you make a law, it filters down. I know that people say that, well, we have laws, but they're not enacted. But maybe we're not totally aware of how they can be enacted. And I always come to the experience of sitting next to a social worker whose job was child protection. So said to him, gave him an example of one of the stories that the women have told us in their childhood, and asked him what he thought about that. And he said, well, I would say the child had a bad dream or saw a bad movie. If there was no law, there's a gap. But if there's a law, it starts filtering down. And even though we might see it not in the court, we might see it in the fact, like this social worker, next time a child told about non-state torture, he might or she might think about, okay, I learned that in my schooling. So it's to understand how the law can filter right down, and then what it does, if somebody says, well, it's not in the law, so they can just dismiss it. If it's in the law, then it means that, yes, such crimes exist. So I just want to explain how important the law is and challenge the thought that they don't get enacted. Maybe we're not looking exactly how they do get enacted.
I will just quickly add in 30 seconds that, adding on what Jean just said, the law is important for three aspects. Yes, for the victim, because the victim has to know what crime she was subjected to exactly. For the punishment, because different laws have different punishments, and being punished for abuse when what has been committed is really torture is completely out of the question if we want to achieve accountability. And also there is a third dimension that is for the perpetrator, the perpetrators themselves. People should know that if they commit torture, they will be punished as torturers, and they will not find loopholes, they will not escape that definition, that punishment, and that is also very important.
I'd just like to say as well that, as well as it becoming law in every country, I'd like to see a feminist human rights approach to torture victimization, post-traumatization informed care as standard and pathologizing people as outdated and abusive.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, Jean, Sylvia, Elizabeth, for your comments and the future and the next steps that we should be looking at for addressing non-state torture and the healing that we should also be focusing on from a feminist perspective. I think we are going to move on to audience questions now. Pat, do we have questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we have fantastic questions, and I'm not sure we'll be able to get to them all, but one interesting question is, has there been a tracing of non-state torture leaking from state torture? Those who work in institutions do not stay in their systems. And has there been a consideration of a global lawsuit for girls and women suggested to these crimes? So it sounds like they're asking, has non-state torture in any way connected with state torture people? And what do we think about that in terms of potentially a global lawsuit?
I would say we certainly have examples of the women who have trusted us with their stories, that some of their perpetrators are state torturers. They wear two hats, you know. We had one woman who fled Canada because of the non-state torture she was suffering, to go to another country because she said her father had a high position in a police department and felt she could be tracked anywhere in Canada. So yes, there can be a cross. And no, I don't know of any massive effort to get the facts right, to stop the discrimination, to make sure that non-state torture comes to the position of a global crime that needs recognition.
It's a great idea, though.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering that. So another question we have in the chat is, since many of these cases, global abuses, appear in many ways, has anyone thought that the perpetrators are sharing their tactics? And have the victims and advocates looked for the who, how, what, when, and how these tactics are being shared?
Well, we do know that some of the informal networks, they share their tactics because they get together as groups, and that's how they learn from each other. Also, intergenerationally, they share their tactics. And I just think there's a general theme of torture, non-state torture, that perpetrators use. I mean, we've heard every kind of imagining torture that you can think of all around the world, and the patterns are often the same. Sometimes there's a little bit of difference in cultural variance, but the dehumanization, any way you can imagine, they've thought of it because that's their pleasure. We haven't mentioned pleasure. The non-state torturers have great pleasure in torturing women and girls, so they share those pleasures and get together and share them as groups. So yes, there is a collective knowing with some groups.
And I would add to that, Patricia, that some of the stories that women have told is that the perpetrators also read the literature, because many are highly educated, so they know the tactics, the psychological tactics. So they're not an isolated group anywhere. The perpetrators have come from every profession that we can think of, from laborer to politician to premier of our province long ago. So we have to remember that there's education in it too. because also the issue is they often have to have professionals if they go too far with the torturing and they think the little girl or the woman they've tortured is at risk of dying. They have also accessed physicians and healthcare professionals to help overcome the emergency. So that's the other bias that we have to make sure we understand, that it can be quite educated, the perpetrators.
Well, we've got one more late breaking question here, and then I think we do have a survivor who would like to share a poem with us before we end this session. But the question on the table here is, wouldn't these abuses as crimes fall under the cases of Nuremberg codes? And can't these lawsuits be begun through countries that have ratified these laws against these crimes, such as through The Hague? Great question.
It is, but I don't really know the answer to that yet. We haven't gotten to that stage yet because we're still trying to gain momentum, but we are thinking of talking to The Hague around, in our opinion, Jean and I both feel it's a crime against women and girls' humanity. So I think someday that's the way it'll be seen. How it unfolds there, we don't know yet. We're still on that path. I just wanted to see where someone asked about education too. So education is key to healthcare professionals so that it doesn't stay framed in as a mental illness, as crime. And yes, we have heard of organized ritualistic groups, and we really debunk all of the myths around that and all the tools that they use to terrify the survivors. It's still really basically another form of torture that we focus on instead of the rituals, because that's just an MO to keep the women and the girls sounding mentally ill. That's been our practice anyways. And we have a section about that in our book as well.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. And I'm curious, I know you're our moderator, Vayuna. Do you have any thoughts about the Nuremberg question?
I don't have thoughts right now with the Nuremberg question, but I wonder sometimes how states and under the conventions in The Hague is able to differentiate or understand torture in the non-state torture context, because I understand that plays a huge role in how the international community thinks of torture, specifically limited to as state torture rather than non-state torture. And with international law, it's interesting because there are definitions, there are terms, there is soft law, like Jean said, and there's an understanding. It's not easy for any institution or international court to deviate from what they've traditionally accepted as their understanding of terms within international contexts. So for me, it's just interesting, and it's, of course, worth a thought on how The Hague and the Nuremberg codes would fall or could be used for non-state torture. I think we have a survivor like Patricia mentioned, who wishes to remain anonymous and read a poem at the end of our session now together. We are hoping technology will be in our favor and we'll be able to share her voice and her poem. But if not, we will make the poem available to all of you registrants after the event. I do see that we have a caller who's joined us. You're probably on mute, so could you unmute yourself and read the poem?
I think you need to mute yourself, Jean. We can hear you typing.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I'm here. My name's Loon Woman. I can be found at loonwoman.wordpress.com. Virtualization. I am a survivor of an unseen war, a war that goes on behind closed doors, in bedrooms and bar rooms and motel rooms, in front of cameras for pornography films. I will not move amongst my silences weeping. I will rise to the accompaniment of women singing. I shout out the truth of pain and degradation. I will not shy from my own touch on my breast. I will reclaim my body from the fists that held it in one hand while they exchanged money with the other. I will not surrender to the white middle-class streets of my childhood with their vacant laughter mocking me, where denial was served with toast and coffee. No one noticed the tortured girl child hidden inside a turtle shell under layers and layers of survival. The child emerges, peeping out at a world that once blamed her for child prostitution, that once shamed her for being raped and child pornography. I embrace her, longing to look into her eyes, but they are the same as my own. From the child, help, nobody out there seems to know what it's like in here, to live with unseen horror that comes up for viewing when you least expect it. I have little control over witnessing pornography, click, of the hardcore variety, click, perpetrated on my child's body, click. The memories shatter moments of peaceful contemplation with pain, horror, degradation, and the infinite greed of males. I run, 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 but there is no hiding from the pornography that was my life as a little girl, teen, young woman, tortured and tied down before the camera. Now they hold my body hostage, being raped and tortured, click, beaten and ravaged, click, and dragged through the gutters of abusers' minds, click, as each new perpetrator clicks on whatever website happens to be portraying me naked. I run, run, run from the thought, but there's a rapist in every corner of my brain, and it hurts when I hear women defending pornography as, quote, freedom of speech. Just how my child body being raped became speech is a mystery not yet unraveled. The only freedom I have is since I got away from the pornographers who owned and sold my body. But yet I am not free of the pictures. I will never go back, but I am forced to rerun, click, the reruns, click, that I wonder are now at this very moment, click, being rerun on the internet, click, this very instant being defended as, quote, freedom of speech. I am a survivor of an unseen war, a war that goes on behind closed doors. Every 9 seconds, a woman is beaten. Every 30 seconds, a woman is raped. Now with the internet, click, every second click of every day, click, a woman can be viewed being raped in pornography, click. It's time we stop calling this freedom of speech and recognize it as the documentation of crimes that it is. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Loan, for reading out the poem for us. I'd like to thank our guests today for talking to us and thank all of our participants for being here. Thank you for your insights and the work that you're doing for all of these years to support gender justice. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Patricia Cumby and Olivia Reed, for ensuring this conversation went smoothly on the technical side. We've included links in the chat to learn more. And if you would like to support Global Rights for Women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivor voices as the means to achieving systemic change. You will receive an email in the next few days with resources as well as a link to the recording. Thank you to those caring enough to listen and then making the changes necessary in your personal lives, at work, in your communities, within the state, the province, and the country to ensure women and men have equal access to safety, security, opportunity, and a life free of gender-based violence. Once again, thank you all for being here. It was an honor to share this space with each one of you. Olivia and Pat, I think we can stop the recording.